So good evening, everyone. Welcome to Backyard Forestry for April 2025. We have a special guest this evening, Dr. Kass Urban-Mead, and her presentation is Pollinators in the Woods, Exploring Many Ways Wild Bees Nest and Forage in Woody Habitats. And we're very honored to have her. She's truly an expert in her field, and she's actually a member of the association. And I'll give you a little background. Dr. Kass Urban-Mead has a PhD from Cornell and a forestry degree from Yale. She currently works at the Xerces Society. If you get a chance to check their website, it's quite impressive. And at the Xerces Society, she provides technical assistance on pollinator conservation in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast region. Is that still accurate, Kass? Yeah. Just wanted to say a big thank you to Brian Donahue, Dr. Brian Donahue, a professor emeritus from Brandeis University, for last month's presentation. He presented his real life story of constructing a house right out of his own forest. And it's memorialized in a book, Slow Wood. And so we thank Dr. Donahue for his presentation. Before I move on, I wanted to also introduce Eileen Murphy, who's on this call with us. And Eileen has graciously offered to assist us at the moment. I hope it will expand, but assist us with the educational efforts of the Forestry Association and our extending our reach and scope. And she has previously worked at, and I'm going to go down this list, Eileen, I think it's the US EPA, the NJDEP, NJ Audubon, and Rutgers University. Did I miss any of the big ones? All good. Okay. So she has tremendous credentials, and she's also a PhD. So she's a great brain helping the organization move forward. Thank you, Eileen. Just a quick request. If you've been regularly enjoying our webinars or attending any of our other activities, or if you own a forest property, or you've noticed that we've been submitting comments on pending legislation that affects your property and the forests of New Jersey, or you simply care about the forests in New Jersey, please go to our website, njforestry.org, and donate or join. Joining is always great because it keeps us in contact and it keeps you coming to our events and participating in the organization. And without further ado, Pollinators in the Woods with Kass Urban-Mead.
Thank you so much. It is such an honor to be here and so many amazing folks here. Let's see if I can multitask and chat while I share a screen. Can you see my screen?
All good.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here. Yeah, I think I'm having a lot of fun reading where in New Jersey or the surroundings folks are calling in from, and to answer the question kind of is my job description still correct? Maybe a little context also for folks is that I just transitioned from being kind of the direct on the ground New Jersey person and greater New Jersey area, worked in Eastern PA too, for the last 3 years. And my colleague and supervisee who just took over my position, Olivia, I just saw she wrote in the chat, and Olivia is now based in Metuchen and responsible for a similar support role, particularly through work with the Natural Resource Conservation Service, if you know about your USDA offices nearby. So I really wanted to know where folks were calling in on. Of course, I've already made my slides. I've already, committed to the pictures and stories that I'm going to tell tonight. But I've really, really loved getting to know all the different parts of New Jersey and how many different forest types there are. And that has huge implications for the types of pollinators that we find in different places and the types of forest habitats that they may rely on or need. So yeah, it's really cool to see folks from basically all over the state and try to speak a little bit to each of you. So yeah, really an honor to be here. And I really love the forests and the bees of New Jersey and the people. So thanks for having me tonight. I'm gonna just jump right in here because I got a lot of fun stories I want to tell you. And the Xerces Society, if you haven't heard of us, is an invertebrate conservation nonprofit. We were founded in 1971 and are named after the Xerces blue butterfly, who is sadly extinct. The idea being that we hope to help prevent similar losses of other charismatic, beautiful, and ecosystem supporting and worthy in their own right species from becoming extinct again. And I just heard from a colleague the other day, actually, that the X was also meant to be reminiscent of extinction, which I hadn't heard until somebody got to have dinner with their founder, Robert Pyle, a couple weeks back. So we have a whole range of different conservation programs, and we operate on the philosophy that we want to do everything we possibly can based on the most recent, most up-to-date, and carefully considered research, but also that there are enough things that are clear and the action and needs for pollinator and other invertebrate conservation are urgent, and that we know enough to act now. So we try to integrate those principles into on-the-ground, practical, responsive, applied conservation. And I need to throw up this extremely long list to say thank you so much to many of our supporters, and also to highlight that we are a member-supported organization. And so if any of you listening today are members, and I see some familiar names and I know some of you are, thank you so much for what you do. We're facing some pretty unprecedented times with our funding landscape. And it has always mattered to have our members, and it may matter more and more every day. So we're really grateful to those of you who are members. And if you feel inspired or moved after this talk today, we would welcome you as part of our team. So on that note, Xerces likes to say that we are supporting the life that sustains us. And that is because, as in this incredible slide that my colleague Lisa designed, we understand that whether or not everyone on this call is going to love bugs by the end of this talk, I hope you do, we know through so many channels that invertebrates are, as we say here, the heart of a healthy landscape. Whether you're interested in larger food chain resiliency and other animals higher up in the food chain, biological pest control in both natural and managed ecosystems, the predator and parasitoid services provided by invertebrates is enormous. I'm, of course, on the pollinator team with Xerces and think a lot about pollination services, both to agricultural and wild plants. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Plant seed dispersal, highly relevant for some of the spring ephemerals that I'll talk about later tonight. Ants and other organisms are really important for seed dispersal. We have a whole really cool team that studies water filtration by mussels and seeks to understand water quality and invertebrates as indicators of those. And you should ask my colleague Julie about dung beetles. You've never heard anyone be so passionate about decomposers in the soil until you've heard Julie talk about dung beetles. So invertebrates are really keeping our systems going. Yes, and I see a Xerces ambassador on the call who's called out, and I can't possibly list everything, but I would be remiss not to call out our incredible, dedicated, highly trained volunteers who are just a wealth of knowledge and help keep us going. We are also motivated increasingly urgently by the clarity in study after study that many of our invertebrates are declining. These are just some data from charismatic taxa. We don't have numbers for all of the hundreds of thousands of invertebrates worldwide because not everybody has been monitoring them. But what we do know from abundance and biomass studies and from repeated surveys of previously studied areas and these charismatic taxa, we're facing some really striking declines with strong implications for ecosystem functioning. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you think about it, there's not one smoking gun where we can say, aha, we just banned one more chemical and we've saved all of the invertebrates. We really are dealing with a system-wide challenge to broader ecosystem health, as I'm sure everyone on this call knows. And this paper by David Wagner and colleagues characterized this as death by 1,000 cuts. Today, my talk is going to be largely in the spirit of thinking about habitat needs and habitat loss, habitat degradation. But these things are interacting at all times with resource competition from invasive species, from pesticides, from disease pressures, and how all of those things interact with increasingly rapidly changing climate and unpredictable weather patterns. So with that as a little bit of just a big picture background, I'm going to kind of give you an intro to why we would even look in the woods for bees at all. That may seem counterintuitive, and I'm thrilled that so many of you showed up, if that sounded weird to you, to figure out why. With that motivation, then we can talk about what it means to call a bee a forest-associated bee. I am going to be largely talking about bees today, although many, many other beloved invertebrates, including other pollinators, do use the woods. We're going to be talking about bees today. And then we'll start on the forest floor and work our way up to the canopy, telling as many natural history stories as we can pack into this hour, so that you will be well equipped to get out in the woods over the coming weeks and months and maybe see some interactions that may have been easy to overlook in the past, and tie it all together at the end with some management implications. So what the heck is a bee, right? Get us started. A lot of us are used to thinking of the European honeybee, our beloved agricultural bee, which is not native to this continent, but an absolutely beloved agricultural creature. I love honey. Honeybees are my first love. But the category of bee is actually a lot broader than just our well-known honeybee. And the way that I like to define this is to say that bees are fuzzy, vegetarian cousins of wasps. We'll do each piece at a time. Vegetarian is where we'll start. About 120 million years ago, some ancestors of today's bees and wasps were foraging on flowers, maybe looking for thrips, and we're like, huh, this is a vast, anthropomorphization, right? Okay, but they're like, huh, this pollen, this nectar hanging out on this flower where I've been trying to catch an insect to feed to my babies, that has a lot of protein and lipids and macronutrients in it too. Maybe I can feed that to my bees, right? So over generations and my babies, generation after generation after generation, this whole group of what were formerly just wasps, right? Began to specialize on just feeding their babies pollen and nectar. And this led to just an enormous diversification of what we now know as bees. And we call that being vegetarian because they're eating plant parts, right? They're eating pollen and nectar. That's a plant, as opposed to their cousins, the wasps, who feed their offspring on other invertebrates, like the caterpillar pictured here, like spiders, like you've heard of maybe cicada killers. They bring cicadas back home to feed their offspring. Bees are restricted to plant parts, floral oils, pollens, and nectars to feed their babies, and they're super high in protein. Over evolutionary time, in order to do this really, really, really well, they developed these branched hairs on their legs, which allowed them to carry the pollen really home very successfully. So you can see that on the back of this common eastern bumblebee here, that this big load of pollen is packed into this special corbiculate structure on the back of her legs. And all bees will have these branched hairs as kind of a characteristic of the group, even though there's enormous diversity of different shapes and sizes of bees within that group. All right, so fuzzy, that's the branched hairs. Wasps don't need those because they're not carrying home tens of thousands of pollen grains every time they go out to get a food. Vegetarian and wasp cousins, right? So different than wasps. Carpenter bees are indeed vegetarian. Yes, they're going out to look for pollen and bring it back to those nests, even if they're in the wood. I'm just looking an eye on the chat. That's what that comment was for. So over those 120 million years since bees have been diversifying, we have over 20,000 different species worldwide. And I have just a snapshot of pictures here to show you, if you kind of look at each one in turn, their pollen is carried on different parts of their body. They're fuzzy in different parts of their body. Their colors are different. They're using different flowers. And imagine you're as small as that bee. Those flowers are huge relative to you, right? So it makes sense that bees get to have really complicated relationships with different flowers because of the way that they need to interact with them in order to get as much pollen as they can during their life cycles. And there are about 350 species of bees in New Jersey. and over 450 in New York, over 4,000 in the United States, 5,000 on this continent, 20,000 worldwide. European honeybee is none of those, right? Because it's native to Europe and now is here as a wonderful agricultural animal, like a chicken or a cow, right? Beloved, agricultural, managed. Unlike the honeybee, the vast majority of our wild bees actually live solitarily. So that percentage of our bees that have that incredible complex social structure is actually the exception to the rule. 90% of our wild bee species live alone, which also means they're very, very gentle because they don't have a whole hive where they develop a caste of guard bees who goes out to protect honey from mammals coming by, right? Instead, each female lives alone, and she has not a lot of motivation to risk losing all of her reproductive output by chasing down a human. So they're very, very, very gentle. And the vast majority of their lives are spent in their juvenile stages, and they fly just for a couple weeks of the year. So I know that some folks submitted questions, curious about the life cycle. I got you here. So if you were a soil nesting solitary bee active in the early spring, here is an example of what your life cycle might look like. You may have spent this winter as a pupae, and when the temperature and moisture cues became correct, they would emerge in the early spring. The males emerge a little bit before the females, they mate, and then we see this part of the life cycle, right? Where this bee is on a flower collecting pollen. But every time they leave that flower, or when they leave a set of flowers that they visited and their legs are full and they need to fly home, they have to go back to their nest, right? They don't just keep going, munching on pollen. They have to fly home every time they take a trip. And what they're doing is they're going back to their little nest. In this case, the example is a soil nesting bee. They scrape the pollen off their body, off their legs, mix it with a little bit of nectar. Maybe they need to regurgitate. They've stored it in their crop. And then they go back out and get more until they've done enough trips to create a single pollen ball big enough to feed a single baby bee. They lay an egg on it, close it up. That's the extent of the parental care. That's the end of the care that they do. And they do as many little chambers as they can before that adult bee's life is over, which you can see for this example bee may end in May. And then those bees develop underground and don't come out again until next year. So if you're looking at this example, you might say, but Kass bees aren't only out in April, what are you talking about? And so if you hang out with this schematic for a second, we can understand that our solitary bees come out kind of in waves throughout the season. It's not quite this equal across the season. There's kind of like periods that are more intense and less intense. But generally, even though we go out all the time in the growing season and think, yeah, there's the bees on the flowers, they're actually changing throughout the season when it comes to all these solitary bees. All right, I'm going to introduce one more life cycle right now. So if life cycles are intense for you, this is the only other one I'm going to do right now. I'm not going to keep going. So just stick with me, okay? Because bumblebees are social bees, right? We just learned 90% are solitary. Honeybees are the exception, but we do have some native bees that are social, and bumblebees are among those. But bumblebees are actually only social during the summer. And you can see here at the top, I have just a single overwintered queen labeled at the top of this circle. And that's because the queens are solitary during the winter. They overwinter all alone, like a black bear hibernating, come out in spring, lay their eggs, and start a social colony throughout the season. And then they collapse back down after the new queens and the males mate. Then they go back and they hibernate for the winter again. But during that whole summer period, there is an abundant diversity of worker bees with a social structure who we do see on flowers, and we see them all season long. So if we go back to our schematic and we think about those solitary bees changing species throughout the season, we also have taxa like bumblebees who are out all season long, even though the life stage of the colony is changing throughout the year. Okay, so with that as background for like two really broad brush groups to introduce you to our over 300 bee species in New Jersey, right? Just start you with a rule of thumb there. The diversity of these different bees is super, super important. On a per visit basis, many of our native solitary bees, because they have evolutionary relationships with different types of flowers, are more effective on a per visit basis than a honeybee may be. This is especially important for South Jersey blueberries and cranberries. And then many of our wild plants have really specific relationships with a pollinator who is incredibly well tuned to finding and using that plant. We also know that if you just sample at 1 minute, you might say, oh, these 5 bees are the most important ones. But if you come back the next year, there may have been some changes to the community. If you measure that same crop in another part of the state, you might see that different bees are doing it. So we know that diversity of species provides redundancy and resiliency, even as land use changes, as the weather is unpredictable. Maybe one species has a bad parasite outbreak. The more diversity of species we have, the more resilient our pollination services are to the plants that we so desperately need to get pollinated every year. And we do know that diversity loss of pollinators will reduce plant reproductive success overall. Many of our pollinators are threatened due to the synergistic pressures that I introduced at the beginning of this talk. And again, habitat loss and habitat quality decline are broadly what I'm going to be talking about today, but synergistic, and I like to repeat this just because it's also interconnected, pesticides, pathogens, homogeneous floral diets, like in highly simplified agricultural landscapes like almond orchards, and synergistic effects with changing climate. And so you might say, okay, cool. Well, don't we know everything about the bees? Why am I only hearing about this now? Why are you telling me something new about forests today and here in 2025, right? But until we started as kind of a culture worrying about high winter losses of the agricultural European honeybee, my first love, there was hardly any like huge widespread research funding and initiative culturally to really think about all these wild bees and all their life histories. There were some entomologists on whose research we draw really heavily, who were part of a really small community who were paying attention to them and had a lot of knowledge that we can now draw on. But now, you know, there's just been an explosion of research since the headlines around 2006, 2007, which is when I was in high school, and I'm part of this generation of researchers who came up worried about pollination services and only began in the last 15, 20 years to really start to tease apart many of these more complex interactions with our wild bees, which is why we're learning things about wild bees that you might hear for the first time today, that bird people have known about birds for decades, right? So it's a really cool moment where we can be like, wow, there's still so much to learn about bees. Okay, so in agricultural systems, we know that natural habitat has been largely highly correlated with higher pollinator abundance and diversity. Natural habitat has been correlated with buffered pesticide exposure and lower pathogen loads. So the reason this is on this slide is because when people started worrying about the European honeybee having high colony losses, the first round of research that we started to do as a research community was starting in agricultural systems and saying, oh gosh, if the honeybees are all dying, who's going to do that work? Are there any backups? And actually the Winfrey Lab based at Rutgers, so New Jersey leading the charge here, published a really important paper in 2007 studying New Jersey crops and saying wild bees are buffers. They provide a native insurance to high colony losses because of their high pollination services. And this high pollination service can actually translate to higher crop yields and resiliency, right? And so we're going to the forest here today, I promise, but I'd like to give you this background because forests and hedgerows kept coming out in these kinds of studies that started in agricultural systems as highly correlated with crop pollination success. Both at the landscape scale, right? Different fields with different amounts of habitat nearby had more bees in them with more forest nearby. You would even see that effect in a single orchard row. The closer you get to the forest, the more bees there might be, which is amazing. And some studies, especially in strawberry, were finding that having hedgerows nearby led to the increased yield and marketability of those crops. So this is what that might look like. So spring crops were most supported by adjacent forests, hedgerows, and woodlots. And that even in highly simplified landscapes, even a small forest patch can have this effect. And a recent review found that this was clear in over 10 different countries, particularly in spring crops. Okay, so what does this mean for management, right? Usually when we think of pollinator habitat, and this is work that I do every day, I was helping people think about how to install meadow habitat in landscapes just earlier today, right? We work really hard to design meadows and gardens that have continuous blooms from June through October. And this is because this is the classic summer bloom period. But if we think about our life history of these turning over species throughout the year, that classic pollinator meadow period really only covers this later summer period, right? But some really important research out of Michigan was finding, and this was part of a growing trend of research, that when we looked at the pollinators who were visiting adjacent wildflowers and those visiting early spring woody crops, there was actually hardly any overlap between the pollinators who were visiting the spring wildflower and the summer wildflower enhancements and the pollinators who were actually visiting the spring crops. It doesn't mean they weren't doing good work. There were important pollinators visiting them, but they were different pollinators than the pollinators in the spring. And so when people started saying, "Ooh, I wonder if we're supporting the spring pollinators enough with these herbaceous enhancements," they started looking at the pollen loads carried by the bees in those early spring crops and found that instead, the most important pollen resources that were also being used to support those early spring pollinators were woody taxa, willows, maples, cherries, sumac, and similar research again in upstate New York that really inspires some of the research I did was in cherry, maple, willow, hawthorn, and even some really surprising wind-pollinated taxa like ash and beech. And so we started to wonder if in really broad strokes, kind of, again, a simplified characteristic of the landscape, if these woody resources in early spring might be a really big part of supporting that colony, launching those groups of bees in the early spring before they then move out into meadow habitats later in the season. So remember this relay of bees, and maybe they're using different things over the season. So this brings us to kind of say, okay, well, let's think more about the forest, right? We live in landscapes that are historically forested. Today, New Jersey is still 42% forested, which I think is really cool. And folks who only drive on the turnpike would do well to remember. We have a lot of important forest habitat here. But it makes sense that if you are a native bee who's evolved on this landscape for, over 1 million years, that you would have some relationship, or that at least some of our bees would have some relationship with the forest. And indeed, it's not that surprising, because when we think about habitat, we think about having food, shelter, and protection, right? Those are things, bees, they're just like us. They need so many of these habitats. And so I'm going to walk through some elements as we go from the understory to the forest floor about ways that different parts of the forest do provide food, shelter, and protection to different parts of our community of bees. And I think that in addition to just the recency of this research that I like to kind of highlight, we just didn't have as much pollinator research until the last 15, 20 years into all these wild bees life cycles. Also, when you walk around in the forest during the summer, especially thinking about, the forests of North Jersey that are more familiar to like the upstate New York ones I grew up with, the deciduous forests, not fire-driven pine. In the summer, the understory is dark after leaf out, which is when most of bee research happens. It's when most of us are looking for bees. I'm going to talk about the resources provided by forest canopies later on in the talk, and canopies are really hard to reach. They're hard to see, they're backlit, the flowers are tiny, they're far away. And a lot of the trees in the springtime are wind pollinated, and so had historically just been discarded as unlikely to be providing any resources. But I'm also going to complicate that story later in the talk. Okay, so now that we've known kind of why we decided to look in the woods at all, how do we identify what counts as a forest-associated bee, right? And this is kind of a funny idea when we think about bees, because we're so used to thinking of bees in our gardens, in our meadows, in our yards, and that's true. They are there. But we don't treat most other organisms as a big homogeneous block once we know how many species there are, right? It would be silly to say, like, birds are only in the tree in my front yard. We know that there's different groups of bees who use different groups of birds who use conifer forests, different groups of birds who use shrublands, and they do use different parts of those forests for different stages of their lives. Well, invertebrates and bees are similarly complicated in ways that are really cool. And so I just have an example here from other invertebrate taxa. The eastern ironclad beetle is a mature forest associate, only found in complex forests with some really big trees and lots of dead wood, so older forest characteristics, whereas the Karner blue butterfly is highly characteristic and representative of forests that receive regular disturbance, right? It relies on a fire-driven lupin and relies on those regular openings and disturbances. And so again, calling back to one of the leading, world-leading researchers in pollinator diversity, again, right in Rutgers, they did a really careful study characterizing all of the bees or as many bees as they could, sorry, not all of them, in the Northeast into these habitat associations. And when they did this based on extremely careful site selection, cross-referenced with museum records following the regrowth of our second growth forests over the last 150 years, where that was appropriate, they were able to classify roughly 32% of our northeastern bees as being fully forest associated. The more mature forest there is on the landscape, and these ones also, the more of those bees there were, but not of the other categories of bees. And also these were the only species who had increased in abundance over the last 150 years as the agricultural fields that were largely abandoned, as many farms moved farther west, and lots of our forests, again, as most of us know, I think, are second growth forests, or some stage of regrowth. Those were the only ones that increased over that time period. Another 37% were what they called habitat generalists, who were found in lots of diverse landscapes with both forest and some open habitat. And then another 37, the final 37%, were really what they called synanthropic or open habitat, agricultural and urban, highly modified landscape associated bees. And so having a diversity of habitats and heterogeneity and a sufficient amount of forest is required in order to maintain this full complement of all of the taxa that we know of, right? And I hinted at this a little bit before by telling you that we overlook our forest-associated pollinators when we only study in the summer. And again, another really important research paper found that the bulk of the bee activity, both numbers of species and number of bees total, is really peaks in these spring months. This from April, so any minute now, right? Through the end of May. And then once the canopy closes, you catch a lot more bees even using bee sampling measurements, as well as they just are less visible. And again, I'm talking about deciduous forests, more like North Jersey here right now. And so this high spring abundance is actually, and also because now you know that a lot of the bees change over the season, these are also in large part different bees out in the spring in the forests than the bees that we see later on in agricultural and urban settings, which is what they studied here. We know also that when we drop below at least 30 or 40% of forest cover in the landscape, we begin to lose these forest-associated bees. So when I give talks to the folks in the Adirondacks, they're not worried about dropping below 40%, or northern Maine, right? I gave a talk to folks in Maine the other week, over 80% forested. They're worried about habitat quality at that point, less so than total forest cover. But when we get down into New Jersey, we start to worry about total forest loss and the loss of this habitat, especially when we remember that bees can't just keep moving across the landscape, but after every foraging trip, they have to go back to their nest, right? And so we really want to, one of the major takeaways from this talk that I'm going to have is we don't want to convert forested land to non-forested land. Later on, I'll talk about how desperately many of our forests need active stewardship and careful, thoughtful intervention to help them remain healthy and diverse throughout the future. But that's different than converting them to non-forest uses, right? And see how cool they are. We want to keep them. And again, here, just another way to visualize this same idea, because I think this can be helpful for folks, is that there are about a third of bumblebees, which of course we all love bumblebees. They're like the teddy bees. So I can't speak for you, but many of us love bumblebees. About a third of bumblebees are really highly associated with highly forested landscapes. That's particularly this Bombus vagans highlighted here. Bombus impatiens, which is the bee you see most often in New Jersey and across the East Coast, is a habitat generalist. It's highly adapted to different forest covers and different landscape types. And then there's fully open habitat associated bumblebees who seem to really thrive in highly unforested landscapes. All right, so let's talk about what they're doing there. That's more fun. Thanks for bearing with the long intro, but hopefully it makes you feel ready to go. And so I'm going to mostly spend my time talking about this kind of, what we might think of as a more mature forest habitat, because it is so much more intuitive how important a young forest is, right? That looks like a meadow, that looks like a garden. We know that when that area opens up, all those bees will spill out and use all the flowers there, right? Except for the specialists I'll introduce. So a young forest, a recent timber harvest, a blowdown where there's a gap in the woods, those create a big flush of flowers and raspberry canes, and that creates just an enormous buffet of pollinator resources. But what's less intuitive is what the bees were doing in the forest adjacent to it before they flew out to visit that open habitat, or maybe they were the open habitat bee who comes in. So I want to talk about that kind of magical habitat association. So to do so, I'm going to go through these one at a time, a couple of them. So don't let this be overwhelming. I'm just giving you our kind of intro schematic here, where I have some different habitat elements of different forest types. And we'll walk through a couple of them in a row, and hopefully there'll be things that you'll get to see later this season. So the first one I want to introduce are specialist pollinators on understory flowers, one of my absolute favorite topics. So what in the world is a specialist bee? A specialist is a really cool idea. There are lots of insects and there are lots and lots of plants, right? And so there's a competition out there to get enough food and to get the food that you want to get that can allow you to reproduce. And if you're active for just a couple weeks, as opposed to being out all season long and needing to be able to change as the flowers change, maybe you fly during a period of time when all of the flowers are kind of the same community. So the example of this is many of our spring flying bees who are out on the sunny forest floor in the early spring may have noticed, oh, wow, there's always trout lily blooming when I'm flying. And so it's a great evolutionary strategy for them to say, oh, I can collect tons of trout lily pollen, bring that back to my babies, get really, really good at recognizing trout lily. Maybe I can nest where the trout lily flowers. Maybe my babies can get, right, their larvae can get really good at digesting the pollen kind of in their digestive tracts. Super, super cool. And so then you can be really efficient with your foraging and you can make many more pollen balls. And if you are lucky enough to specialize on a flower that other bees don't like, you've also become free from competition. So the trout lily mining bee, trout lily is called Erythronia americana, and this mining bee that specializes on it is called Andrena erythronii. So it's actually named for the bee whose pollen it is reliant on. This is a different Andrena whose name doesn't match quite as well, but it's a specialist on wild geranium. Here's Geranium maculatum. This is Andrena distans. And I have a little video here, I hope you can see it okay, of a kleptoparasite of the Andrena actually collecting nectar from a trout lily. So just infinite complicated relationships develop. This is another really wonderful one that you can find all over New Jersey. This is the spring beauty mining bee that specializes only on spring beauty, Claytonia virginiana. And it has these high pink pollen grains. So its legs actually look almost pink when it's packed full of the pollen loads. And I love this one because there's some really wonderful old papers from, this paper is from 1975, so not that old, sorry. But they have a picture here on the left of the light hitting the forest floor, where there was a nesting aggregation of all of these wonderful solitary bees. And then a couple weeks later, the leaves had all come out and there was shade on the forest floor. And even these researchers who were specialized couldn't find the nests anymore because the bees were done for the year. The leaves had covered it. It was too dappled. So it's really a short period of time. This second picture here is like what a tunnel looks like as it goes down underground, and then these chambers, like a vertical cross section of all those chambers underground. And if you're lucky enough to find one of these aggregations, you can find the little face peeking up at you, which is pretty darn cute. There are specialists on lots and lots of other taxa. There's specialists on violets, specialists on bellwort, and there's a wonderful PDF free and available online called Creating a Pollinator Garden for Native Specialist Bees that has the list of all of the known flowers that host a specialist bee that can only use that pollen. It's not only limited to spring ephemerals. So if you find this PDF, which I'm happy to share in the chat later, you can find many, many familiar plants and come to know their specialists. All right, I'm going to move on to deadwood, one of my absolute favorite topics, especially if you're not used to thinking of forest characteristics. You just ignore the logs maybe, or walk along them, or, ignore them. But actually, this deadwood is a really cool resource. One of my favorite things about our wood nesting bees is that a lot of them are really shiny and iridescent. Here is Lasioglossum caeruleum on the left here and Ogichlora pura on the right. And these are like small jewels flying through the air, and they nest in rotting logs. And I do have a little note here. Why do you think they're so shiny? Put your guesses in the chat or raise them up during the Q&A, and I'll see what you think. We can chat about it later. And I have a really wonderful colleague who likes to make the joke, boring beetles lead to interesting bees. And what she means is, if you have a structure of a log or a snag or a stump where a beetle had drilled an entrance hole, then once that log, or once it was dead, then once that beetle is gone, if it's left an entry into the soft, now decomposing wood, the bees can maybe use that as an entry and then dig out the chambers where they then provide pollen for baby bees. So what that can look like, first of all, adorable, this shiny green bee going into and coming out of a log with just enough external structure that it doesn't fall apart, but soft enough inside that this little bee, which doesn't have very strong jaws, it's not a carpenter bee, doesn't have strong jaws, can still dig out these kind of tunnels and provide pollen for their babies. And because this is a talk in New Jersey, I was especially excited to show you this little story, which is, this is the Pine Barrens, this is Black Run Reserve near Evesham, and it's primarily pine, historically fire-driven, ericaceous shrubs everywhere, but I got distracted by a Carolina wren while walking along a little wet stream. There were some more deciduous trees here, and I started staring at this stump, this kind of tall stump, and I was like, I feel like there might be bees in there. Then I was drinking my water, looking at the wren, and started staring. And this video is hard to see, but there's a tiny little bee who flies out right about 2/3 of the way up later on. And I'm going to play it maybe 2 more times. Okay, it's loading. And then where my mouse is here, there it goes. This is a little mason bee. And I play this video partly, and don't be mad at me, partly because it's so hard to see. Because I think that so many of the reasons that we don't notice bees in the woods is because many of their associations are not the super charismatic ones, right? Like a bee visiting a spring ephemeral, once you learn to notice that, that is really charismatic. But many of these nesting associations or overwintering associations are much more cryptic and easy to overlook if you aren't really, really tuned into it. And so I thought this was a really cool moment, right? You wouldn't think of this as bee habitat based on that aerial Google photo, right? But we needed that deadwood. Another one of my favorite stories, this was in a forest up near Princeton. I was walking around roughly this time of year in a really small forest preserve in early spring, and I found a whole aggregation of solitary sweat bees nesting, or sorry, these were actually social sweat bees, nesting in this suspended dirt in a tip-up of a downed oak tree. Very, very cool. There's only one other paper that even starts to talk about this, and it's based in Florida with a really specific kind of chimney bee. So it's really poorly recorded, but there were just tons of tiny little black bees. You can see not much happening in the canopy there, really big, long downed tree. You wouldn't think of this as a place to look for bees. And then here's all of these little sweat bees minding their own business, nesting in this soil. All right, bumblebees, back to bumblebees, one of our beloved charismatic taxa. So we introduced the bumblebee life cycle before, right? Solitary in the winter when the queen overwinters, and then social throughout the summer. And so this is a figure, sorry, it's a little cut off at the bottom. That's surprising to me. So The bumblebees overwinter like a big black bear, right? Imagine a bear stocking up on nutrition in the fall in order to have big fat reserves to survive through the winter. And then come out in spring and need to get a lot of resources really, really quickly in order to have both the nutrition to keep flying around looking for a new nest site after a long, cold winter, and also to have the nutrition to continue to lay eggs. And start the new colony. And once that bumblebee queen has stocked up on the flowers that she needs in these next coming weeks, the bumblebee queens are probably already doing it in New Jersey. I'm in upstate New York. We're still maybe a week or two out. Then all of the worker bees will be the ones that we see all summer long. And as we know, they are all in our crops and all in our gardens and meadows. But many of our bumblebees who are forest associated are making these nests in abandoned rodent burrows, in rotting logs. We have a lot of stone walls that have little protected crevices where a little bumblebee nest, where you can see it kind of looks like a pile of honey pots all next to each other with all these little bees crawling all over it. And then at the end of the season, the bumblebee queens usually overwinter within just a couple meters of where their colony is. This is very poorly studied. The couple of really cool pollinator or bumblebee researchers who've studied this have found that the bumblebee queens may only go a couple meters away from where their summer nest was in order to overwinter all winter long in the duff or the leaf litter. And so this is also one of my favorite times of year in the woods. You usually hear these guys before you see them. Here's a bumblebee queen doing kind of its characteristic bumbling in the early spring, where you can hear it going, checking out little dark spots, little patches beneath a leaf, little dark hole underneath a log. And sometimes it'll go down a little hole for a whole minute. And I've watched this and been like, oh my gosh, I just watched a bumblebee find her nest. And then after like 30 seconds, 45 seconds, she chose some reason to reject it and flew off to go find another spot. So they have to do, a lot of work in this early spring, and they need nutrition to do so after coming out of hibernation. So this brings me to a really important quality forest health topic, which is that some really careful researchers in Colorado characterized the pollen that different bumblebees were using throughout the forest season. Throughout the growing season, and found that the bumblebee queens, and active in early spring, were using primarily forest understory forbs. And then the workers later on in that season were using the pollen from open habitats, grasslands and wetlands. And then they went back in the historical records and looked at which species, based on careful botanical surveys, were declining over that time period. And it was only the forest taxa. And so they concluded that this was a bottleneck stopping the bumblebees from being able to found their colonies in the early spring. This one is most carefully studied because it is federally listed. And so this brings us to a question of what are the threats to the spring understory forbs that are both important for the specialists who can't switch away from them, and from species like the bumblebees who have more generalist diets, but use those forbs in the early spring in this bottleneck period. And nobody in New Jersey probably will take this as a surprise, but one of many of the threats that we have is excessively high levels of deer browse. What I've highlighted here on the left is what folks call the deer browse line. You can kind of see that there's nothing growing in the understory, even though it looks like there's all these nice mature trees. And if you look down out over that hillside, there's kind of a brown band right above the ground. And that's everything being nibbled away in this really, really high deer population level of browse. And here on the right is a seedling that's been eaten just over and over and over again. And of course, deer are a wonderful native species. They're a conservation success story, that they've actually rebounded now to levels that are just astronomically higher than the levels at which our forest plants have evolved. So we have a system that's out of whack here that can be cascading through even to our pollinators. I'm going to skip past this slide in the interest of time. Because we're going to talk about South Jersey a little bit too today, I would be remiss not to talk about fire and ericaceous shrubs. So that's the introduction here. And our charismatic bee to be the ambassador for the fire diversity is the southeastern blueberry bee. And so first I want to just introduce you to some other research that has been kind of growing across the country. This was some work done out west, where they found that what they call pyrodiversity, or the heterogeneity or diversity of different intensities of fire across the landscape, correlated positively with the pollinator diversity in those places. So the different ages and frequencies and intensities of burns nearby meant that there were different kinds of flowers in the different patches that had burned more or less recently. There was different amounts of open soil or different kinds of textures of dead wood, depending on how intense the burn had been. And so the more diversity around kind of a focal sampling area, the more bees they got, because there were all these different habitat niches and a wider range than if it was all the same age and there was one kind of flower and one age of deadwood, right? That makes sense. So just, one of the figures from their paper here, as the diversity of fire around a sampling area increased, the number of types of bees also increased. And that was true for low severity burns areas and moderately severely burned areas. But areas that had a history of extreme fire suppression that then had kind of an explosive wildfire, this is out west, so not necessarily South Jersey, but then that area was so severely burned due to the history of fire suppression that it took it a while and it didn't show that relationship. But as long as the fire was mimicking more of the levels of intensity that those forests had evolved with and had kind of moderate and low intensity diversity, then you see that positive relationship. And similarly, in southeastern US, this is work done by some really incredible folks at UGA, University of Georgia. They also had this really incredible study of different burn frequencies in a landscape from 2007, a full decade. And they had areas that had had a different number of burns around the area that they sampled in. And they found, again, more diversity of fire nearby, more types and kinds of bees were able to live in those different habitat niches developed. And they actually found that if there were really, really large burn units that were homogeneously burned, the farther you got into the middle of that burn, the lower the diversity was, because you just weren't getting all the different kinds of bees that were using different ages and different frequencies of fire. So I wanted to just show you an example from, this is again, Black Run Preserve in near Evesham in kind of central Jersey. Don't get mad at me about saying central Jersey. And so on the left, this is a little walking path here that served as a fire break. And you can see on the left, this was an area that had had a recent prescribed burn. And on the right, an area that hadn't burned in a while. And I found pretty consistently that there were a bunch of soil nesting bees nesting in the exposed sand and bare soil in the more recently burned areas of this forested area, whereas in the areas that had been burned a couple of years ago, but they're ericaceous shrubs, they're blueberries and they're gay lussacias, and had all come back. And this is actually the southeastern blueberry bee foraging in some of those shrubs in that same landscape. So these were right near each other. And there was, of course, lots of movement back and forth because of that. And different ages of burn were actually supporting different life stages of this really charismatic bee, who, I'll tell you a secret, is also a really fantastic pollinator of cultivated blueberries and cranberries, which is, I think part of the story of this being the ecosystem where those ericaceous shrubs survive, right? And I had one more video here, which is again, just in this really freshly burned area. The bracken fern has barely even started to pop back up. And, oh shoot. Okay, the bumblebee queens were everywhere here. But I think that this video didn't keep going. So I apologize. I'll find that and send it out later. All right, I'm running a little long because I knew this was an hour and a half. I'd love to still kind of tell my last couple of stories about the canopy and then open it out to questions. I know we're getting close to 8, but because this is forestry in 90 minutes, I couldn't resist packing it all in. So stop me if we need to stop. But all right, I'm just going to tell these last canopy stories. Okay. So again, this kind of last reasons that we had overlooked, particularly deciduous forests, were, okay, keep going, sweet, thank you. Their canopies are hard to reach, right? And also they're dominated by wind-pollinated trees. So first of all, I I'm obviously talking about bees today, but I feel like it's remiss to talk about trees and their importance to pollinators and not just acknowledge how important they are to butterflies and moths. So before I talk about bees in the canopy, I was just wanting to remind everybody, if you haven't seen the incredible research by all the amazing butterfly and moth people, Doug Tallamy is the famous spokesperson for this work. So many of our important native trees are the obligate, meaning can't live without it, host plant for so many of the butterflies who, just like the stories I'm telling today, start on a woody plant or start on a grass, something not obvious where they try to be camouflaged, and then their showy adult form shows up on our flowers. But we need both to keep their full life cycles going, right? So oak, of course, star of everybody's show, love it. Cherry, hickory, tilia, I'm just calling these out because they're host plants for so many Lepidoptera. I have that abbreviated here as LEP, that's topologists speak for Lepidoptera, that's butterflies and moths. But when we talk about the pollen from trees and shrubs, we usually think about our herbaceous plants that Olivia, who's on this call, and I, and so many of our colleagues spend a lot of important time getting established. But trees and shrubs provide a bulk, as I was saying, of that spring resource, right? And I'm quoting here on the left a really amazing, brilliant postdoc, Katie Turo with the Winfrey Lab, who likes to say in her talks, tree canopies are a biodiversity frontier, even here in the Northeast. And so this is some of the research from coming out of the Winfrey Lab right now that they've given us as a really generous preview, where they took they're doing a lot of amazing research on bees across New Jersey right now and categorizing all of the pollen that those bees were using. And they subset the bees that they knew were forest associated and found that over 2/3 of the pollen and nectar collected by those bees, or particularly the pollen, by all those forest associated bees was from trees and shrubs. So the trees and shrubs themselves are a huge resource for pollen and nectar. So who are some of these trees and shrubs? Some of the most well-known that any beekeeper, any amazing person who was out there watching their bees can tell you, maple and willow are right at the top of the game, right? Willow is actually so amazing that there's over 30 different bees who have short lifespans in the early spring that they've decided to specialize fully on willow pollen, just because it's so abundant and so high quality. And here's an andrena, a spring flying mining bee, collecting willow pollen. I just love this. This is a little video I took. I don't even remember where. I got to go check my geolocation. And we have no shortage of red maple, any forester will tell you, in New Jersey, but they are providing really huge volumes of pollen and nectar. So in places where they are appropriate for the ecosystem, a lot of bees are using them, especially in those kind of pine-driven forests. You have a riparian area, you have willow, and you maybe have red maple there. You have Nyssa, Tupelo, those provide huge amounts of resources, right? Okay, there we go. This is a specialist on sumac here on the left. And on the right here, this is actually Calides validus, who is a specialist on blueberry. So we another one on a shrub and another shrubby tree. And then I get really excited about the use of wind pollinated pollen in deciduous forests because it's so surprising. And so one thing that I did during a particularly dark period deep in the pandemic was try to count the number of pollen grains that sugar maple trees make, and cross-validated this with some other studies. These numbers pan out. A single sugar maple tree can make over 100 billion grains of pollen. So you can imagine that if you're a bee going out in the early spring, if the sugar maple are blooming, and this tracks with oak and with lots of other species, like I showed at the beginning, there were a couple of studies that found beech and ash pollen in pollen records. If they can use it, if they can bring it home, they're not trying to pollinate flowers, they're trying to feed their babies. So if they can bring it home and there's enough protein, they'll collect it. And so I like to say, each blooming canopy tree is a meadow in the sky. And this is actually data that I made into a kind of shiny new graph, but is actually from a paper from 1958, where a researcher was studying the pollen loads of early spring flying mining bees and found that a whole bunch of species had over 75% pollen loads of oak pollen. At least one species or two species had almost 50 and over 75% beech pollen, and chestnut pollen, also really important. And here's a video that I took of some bees foraging on oak catkins. Again, not doing any pollination service, not helping make acorns, but taking pollen home for their babies. And I know that there were some questions about pine pollen and softwood pollen, other softwoods. To the best of our knowledge, those conifers have such low protein content that bees actually are not collecting that pollen. So it really is some subset of wind pollinated species that still have really high protein content. I think oaks are like 28% on average across species. And maple is really high protein content, and they have good protein lipid ratios like bees want. These are the kinds of things bee researchers get really into. But conifer pollen is more like 10% protein and doesn't seem to be able to, people have actually tried to rear baby bees on pine pollen and they haven't survived. So it is like, they use more wind pollinated pollen than we thought they did. And this absolutely includes things like grasses. If anybody has cornfields nearby, when the corn blooms, bees are on the corn. So we want to think about that with insecticide exposure, right? So these are wind pollinated species that they do use, but it's not 100% of them. And pine is a major exception to that. So, you know, I was talking about fire-driven pine forests. Those are incredibly important bee habitat if you're a solitary bee who nests in sandy soil and uses fire-driven understories. And maybe some of those species will fly up to the top and collect some resin. Maybe they'll use the conifers as abiotic temperature buffer, but they're not using them for the pine pollen itself as best we know, the way that they might be kind of surprise using oak pollen in an oak forest. So just kind of to wrap up here, what's going on in the forest? We have nesting and overwintering on the forest floor. We have pollen and nectar collection from spring ephemerals. We have nesting in snags, stumps, deadwood, and tip-ups. And we have canopy pollen collection, yes, from our wonderful insect pollinated trees like tulip trees, like nyssa, like red maple, like willows, but even from some of our wind pollinated trees like oaks. And oops, now they're all going to play again. Da 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 da. There we go. And so with that in mind, just like now that we know about this huge diversity of different bees, there's no one size fits all bee tree, right? There's just this huge diversity is important. And the diversity is also what we need to think about when we're thinking about any given piece of land is which trees are appropriate for this particular piece of land. Not to try to pick a top 5 total list, but to say what makes sense on this piece of land given the history and given the future of what we desire and what the future pressures will be for that landscape. Similarly, there's no one size fits all nest, right? We have the shiny green bees nesting in deadwood. We have those bees who nest even in the soil of tip-ups. We have bumblebees overwintering. We have rotting logs. We have all the soil nesters who nobody has studied how jumping worms and invasive earthworms, changing soil structure or legacies of tillage have affected the soil suitability of soil nesting. Those are just giant open questions that we can only guess how disruptive they may have been. And again, we want to have really site-specific goals. In our forested New Jersey landscape. I think this slide is out of order, sorry. So, okay, so yeah, we wanna keep, I'm so sorry, that slide was out of order. So we wanna keep our forests as forests, but then learn to think about what the challenges are. Yeah, I see a question coming in about beech bark disease right now, right? We wanna keep our forests as forests, but learn from people like On Backyard Forestry, the experts who I learn from every month. I am not a forester, I'm just an entomologist. Who are thinking about these threats to the diversity, the age class diversity, the pests and pressures, wanting to have healthy, vibrant, diverse forest canopies that are able to manage the unpredictable weathers of the future and the just onslaught of new pests and diseases. We need to be really thinking hard about what it looks like to protect both our future canopy and our understory from excessive deer browse. And many of our species that need to be regenerated due to disturbance, but we have really, in many parts of the Northeast, highly homogeneously aged forests, where we may need to introduce some disturbance in order to bring back some species of trees that cannot establish under a dark canopy, but maybe historically would have always established after a blowdown or after a storm or after a fire. So we want to think about what it means to have a historically informed kind of future looking approach to helping our forests and the bees who rely on them be resilient as we move forward into this next unpredictable century. And we need to, yeah, here I have forests. We must engage with forests as living, changing systems, and know that forest diversity and health is going to be key for supporting forest-associated invertebrates, but will look different in every landscape. Olivia and I are partner biologists with the Natural Resource Conservation Service. There's 6 incredible offices in New Jersey. I've worked with all of them and can speak highly to them. They can help you get a forest stewardship plan and help financial assistance to help steward that forest. And you're welcome to invite me or Olivia out to help join and think about how to incorporate pollinators into those stewardship plans. And then I'm just gonna leave this here while we chat, because I want to stop and have time for a conversation. So there was just so much going on. I got excited and spoke a little longer than I'd intended, but I hope that that was useful and
No
that we still have
problem
time to
whatsoever.
discuss.
We're all good. So we
Great.
had a bunch of questions. I noticed the reference to beech trees. And then I saw a lot of wheels turning with people on beech leaf disease and other things afflicting the beech trees in our forests. Have you seen
Yeah.
any impacts on the pollinators?
No, to my knowledge, nobody has really looked at that explicitly. So we're kind of inferring. I don't think that beech is a major source of pollen. I can tell you that the studies that, in terms of just like total pollen usage, there's certainly butterflies and moths and other invertebrates who do rely on beech who are almost certainly going to be right, harmed by that. I think about that with every species. I think I saw a comment go by actually about chestnut, and I often like to include a story of the chestnut bee, which was a specialist on chestnut. It's named Andrina Rainey, Rehni, and it only collects chestnut pollen. And it actually turns out that it's still out there in hybrid orchards. It's somehow held on. And so there's a whole really cool cohort of bees led by actually a currently frozen funded lab at USGS, but incredible folks there managing the search for the lost chestnut bee with folks all across the Northeast, going into all these hybrid and reintroduced orchards. So yeah, so but with beech, I think we're gonna probably, my hypothesis would be, if I was writing a grant proposal to try to learn about it, would be that most of the interactions would be indirect with beech, specifically on bees, because I don't think it's the highest protein pollen directly. But certainly when we think about the silviculture of a stand that's had beech as like a major player for decades, the openings to invasive species or the change in what next trees or forbs are going to be able to thrive in that understory, it's really hard to predict those cascades. So yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I know that I did my research on pollen usage in the early spring in upstate New York, basically like the year after most of the ash had died from emerald ash borer, which was really sad. And there were just like a couple sites where a couple individual insects had eaten 100% ash pollen, but it wasn't like enough to really publish on because it was so few. But it was kind of like, oh my God, is this the site where there's like that one ash tree that's like still lingering in the woods? And who knows how much more of a percentage of the resource it would have been if I had just sampled 2 years ago. And so, yeah, all right, I'll stop there.
So did you see anything in the questions that we received electronically earlier that might be relevant? Everybody seems to be focusing on particular types of trees.
Okay, let me pull up the
And
questions.
so I
or if you want to feed
see
me.
questions
Yeah.
in the chat. I saw questions about Norway maple, cedar, beech, as I said. I'm glad you mentioned the ash trees because everybody in New Jersey is suffering with that. Eileen, did
Philip
you have
Poplar,
something?
yeah, incredible
someone asked
nectar
about-
resource.
Oh, I was just going to add to the species of trees, tulip poplars came up as well in the chat.
Yeah, which is a huge species in New Jersey, and
Yes.
grows to the tall. It's the tallest tree in the forest, basically.
I love a tulip tree. They're amazing. I wish that I had studied my own research through, because I had tulip trees in my woods, but you just, when you're doing a research project, you have to bound it somehow with like some period of time. And I just remember being like, but I have to go up and sample in the tulip trees. But we do know that actually, first of all, like there's so much nectar production from in a tulip tree that like the honeybees for sure use a ton of tulip tree nectar, and the wild bees also do, but it's poorly studied. One thing that I just wanted to say about the tulip poplar is there's a really cool bee called Calides thoracicus. It's a cellophane bee that lives in riparian areas all the way down to Georgia. And there's one study, though there's a couple studies that think that its favorite tree is tulip tree. And that there's only one study that kind of noticed that it's consistently on riparian areas in forested landscapes that have mayapple patches. And they think that it's because the little umbrellas pushing up through the leaf litter are creating just enough disturbance that the bees coming up out of hibernation can then use, you know how the little umbrella pushes up out of the leaves and kind of pushes them aside. And so that was their hypothesis, and that was only 2 years ago. And so I want everybody to go out and find their mayapple aggregations on little riparian areas in closed canopy forests and see if you can find Calides thoracicus nesting there, and let me know.
We actually have that kind of configuration on our property, so be easy for
I'll
me
send
to
you the
check.
paper.
But I did see someone in the chat indicated that they quote unquote love cellophane bees. So
Music to my ears. Yes,
yeah,
and
absolutely.
Calides inequalis is the most common one in our area up here. Calides thoracicus is a little more cryptic. And that's the one that people often find in their yards, in their school yards, in graveyards, labyrinths. There's one here that I always watch. They look like a little volcano of soil with a little pencil-sized hole at the top. And then you'll see the little bee's face poking out, just like that one picture I showed of the spring beauty mining bee. And again, if that's happening at a schoolyard or a park near you, they're gentle. Put up a little sign, pollinator habitat. After 4 weeks, they're all going to just be underground again till next year. Don't spray them.
So you sort of just mentioned in there almost
Yeah.
an urban habitat that I might see them in. And
Yeah.
I see a question said, top 3 ways to protect bees in the city. And since we have a lot of urban and community forestry folks attending, maybe you can make some suggestions.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a talk for, backyard forestry with a focus on forest associations. But it is not at all at the expense of the importance of other habitats. And that said, I was actually, while I was working in New Jersey area, lived for a while in like a really dense part of Philadelphia. And I can tell you that a street tree in South Philadelphia is also covered in wild bees. And that is really cool. So I like to think of anywhere you're working in an area with really small parcel sizes or urban areas, try to, just like you would in a forest, right? The insects don't care where the property boundaries are. So you're thinking about the broader landscape that the land that you can touch, whether it's your local park, whether it's the plants you can put out on your balcony patio, whether it's a little unused space or a riparian strip. And I'm happy to share a whole bunch of resources that Xerces has put together for managing in urban areas. Where we want to think about, okay, these street trees, I want to support my street tree plan for urban heat island effect, for water filtration, for cooling, for all the other reasons. And they also are providing a lot of that early spring resource in the spring. In parks and yards and cities, one thing we talk about a lot is that a lot of insects will start their life cycles in the canopies of the tree, but then they need to drop onto the ground in order to complete their life cycle. And so there's a big push among kind of native gardeners to create what we call soft landings, which are beds of ferns or flowers under just underneath the layer. So if you want to keep your lawn, maybe it's a managed park, you really need to keep areas for kids to play. We totally get that. But you want to just create a planting all around the base of that tree, where those invertebrates can complete a life cycle. If they started as a caterpillar and need to drop to overwinter in the soil, if you have a mowed turf or lawn right below it. Minimizing, I'm going to stop at the pesticides. Just minimizing pesticides 100% of the time is always going to be, you know, have an integrated pest management plan if you're in an agricultural or a forested landscape. Urban areas, really try not to use, you know, aesthetically oriented fungicides, herbicides, pesticides, insecticides. It's just a huge exposure route for our invertebrates.
Yeah, somebody asked a question about mosquito spraying affecting bees. And also
Yeah.
I would throw on top of that, since we have a reemergence of the spongy moth in New Jersey now, how about that spraying, which is becoming more prevalent? I will also note, however, that spraying is becoming better with the use of drones. It's very targeted now, and so the amount being sprayed can be greatly reduced. So that's a really good thing.
Yeah, mosquito spraying. We actually have Xerces colleagues who've been putting out they're like a little monitoring strategy in yards across the US with volunteers who know different, who have like a neighbor who sprays, or even people who spray their own yards for mosquitoes and want to know if they're hurting the bees. And they're going to be releasing that study pretty soon. And we do know that they're really not targeted. Those are just killing all the good bugs also. You know, that's a vast oversimplification, but mosquito spraying really, really is a big problem. And yeah, the forest sprays are tricky. A lot of that is BT, which it tends to be more Lepidoptera specialized, but that doesn't mean it can't still have indirect effects on native Lepidoptera, even if it is BT maybe not specialized on bees. So that's a really complicated, vibrant literature that the butterfly folks are most on top of because of the butterfly moth special mechanism. But indirect effects are really important too. Yeah.
So the other question that seems to run through a few that we've received is the interaction between what I'll call, perhaps inartfully, cultivated bees versus native bees. And
sure, yeah.
And how do they interact? You know, if my neighbor was the question, if my neighbor is cultivating bees, how is that affecting my native plants, my native bees, etc.?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, you know, I definitely know that I talk about them as our agricultural bee. And I think that really is, I'm saying about honeybees in this case. There are actually lots of other managed and non-native bees, but just assuming we're going to talk mostly about honeybees right now. They were my first love. And my philosophy around them really is kind of more of an agricultural thinking, which is I also love having chickens, and I eat eggs pretty much every day. And just like we are not going to tell people, well, there's bird flu and it's also hurting wild bees, therefore no chickens allowed in America, right? That's not the cultural response. The cultural response is, what does it mean to be a responsible bird owner or a bird manager or a responsible farm operation who understands that in super high densities or without a disease management program, or in a way that's like really up close, you know, like maybe if you had a huge chicken farm, right, with hundreds of thousands of birds, we wouldn't want that culturally right next to a bird preserve of wild endangered native birds because of the possibility for disease spillover. And these sound like extreme examples, but they're actually pretty on the nose to conversations that bee researchers are having about bees right now. Because the conversation about like one backyard beekeeper is not to vilify that person. That's like one of the only relationships that we get to have that's like really meaningful and close with an insect in this like really complex, cool way where we can create honey. And if you're managing your mites, you're keeping an eye on your, you know, deformed wing virus that mites carry can spill over onto wild bees through sharing the same flower. I know some of the researchers who've studied this, like how long does the virus particle survive under UV light on different shaped flowers? And, you know, what's the viral intensity of defecation or regurgitation that needs to happen for different bee diseases for a wild bee to pick it up and then get sick? And like people have these data now. And a huge part of the problem is really the huge apiaries, or increasingly keeping bees in landscapes without sufficient floral resources to support all the wild bees and some honeybees, because a colony brings in tens of thousands of bees. But I guess the last thing I'll say, the conversation gets super, super important, especially on really, really large simplified agricultural landscapes. So like almond is a really big case study for this, where beekeepers are trucking hundreds of colonies from all over the country into highly simplified landscapes with only one kind of pesticide-laced food source for a couple weeks. They're all like kids in the first week of kindergarten. They swap all their germs. They have to eat the same food all day, and they all go home, and they all get trucked back out, often there's a huge fights on natural areas about whether honeybees who've just been trucked out of almond or some other crops should be allowed to go to national parks to recover. And that's a big conservation issue, where native bee folks are like, whoa, you're bringing all of those, diseases that you just got in that like mess, and spitting them all over the hundreds of bees on this like incredibly beautiful mountaintop. That's a terrible conservation problem. And that's really, really, really different than like one thoughtful backyard beekeeper who carefully monitors for mites and keeps their viral loads low. And like, I don't want to conflate those and want to think about it with that level of agricultural complexity, like backyard chickens versus, runoff from an industrial level manure production.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
yeah.
So I'll ask one more question, and then we'll start to wrap down. Somebody asked, how do I start a pollinator area? What's the best plants to plant? And is there any special soil prep that they should do?
Yeah, maybe I can send a bunch of resources as follow-ups that can be for different types of landscapes. The one place I'll probably just send you right away is the Xerces website, which is xerces.org. And then there's a part of our website called the Pollinator Conservation, oh my God, what's it called? The Pollinator Resource Center. And if you click on our area, you get a whole bunch of resources for evaluating your landscape. We have a guide that kind of walks you through whether you're in a park or an urban area or an agricultural landscape. You can choose which guide makes more sense for you. And then you can kind of run through the different habitat elements that a bee can need and pick out the parts of your landscape that you can make the most difference in. And if you want to plant a pollinator garden, which definitely do. We have some kind of starter lists of really high impact native plants that are native to pretty much all of New Jersey, tend to be available as straight species from most of the nurseries, and are pretty good at surviving in most landscapes. So that's a good place to get started if you're brand new. And you will want to manage the weeds. If you're planting from plants anytime, you definitely want to water them and protect them from deer browse. Learn to monitor them so that you can learn what a weed is and what your desired plant is. And then really the most important thing we want to be doing is helping guide people towards the local resources so that they can choose plants that are really appropriate for your soil type, for your sun exposure, and for kind of that healthy community. So the more local the plant nursery is you can work with, the more local the plant materials are, the more likely you are to be supporting the wild bees of that area. And then somebody's recommending, Susan is recommending the Native Plant Society of New Jersey, which has a lot of really wonderful resources on their website. Jersey Friendly Yards is a wonderful website for choosing herbaceous plants that are local to your part of New Jersey, your local county extension office. And if you're working on any larger scales, definitely reach out to your NRCS office for financial assistance, but they can also do technical support. Quick question, is lesser celandine useful? Most of our non-native species that really smother out an area, there will be some generalist pollinators that will use them, but they usually are not providing for like the specialist bees, and their bloom time is usually offset. So like I worry a lot about forest understories that, because of deer preference and browse, have really thick layers of non-native shrubs in them. And a lot of those bloom kind of in summer. A lot of bumblebees and honeybees will use them because they're generalists who can use lots of different kinds of flowers. But if they've fully shaded out the entire understory and smothered out all those spring ephemerals, you've kind of shot the whole early spring community. So this is kind of why I like to start with like not all bees are the same. Because some really generalist taxa, yeah, keep pulling it out. And lesser celandine, you know, pick your battles too. Like don't destroy your spirit. But yes, if you can keep working on it, that's a beautiful thing. Lesser celandine's a tough one. Yeah, and I think about that a lot also with the trees and shrubs. You know, think about also, are you managing the deer so that if you go to all that work to remove them, you've also changed the background conditions? You know, we don't want to, yeah, you know, we want to think about kind of changing the trajectory of the woods so that if you go to all that trouble to remove them, you're also setting the stage for a new, healthier community to be able to persist long into the future, whether it's the trees and the saplings, the native shrubs, or the native spring ephemerals. It's a lot of good work, but I know there's a lot of really smart people who I've learned a lot from doing that work in New Jersey, and you're not alone if you're just getting started. There's a big, cool world of amazing people working on this. So.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, I think it's been a great evening, and the level of response has just been extraordinary. I've never
that's so
seen
nice
so
to
many
hear.
thank yous and compliments at one of our webinars. So I have to tell you, it was incredible. There's some little floating hearts and hands.
Oh, well,
And
thank you all.
we truly appreciated it. You did such a great job, packed so much into the very brief time we had together, and brought a lot of energy to the subject. And I hope a lot of
I just want
interest.
to tell everybody everything all at once. So
That's all
and
right.
then
There's
learn
a
from
lot of
you.
there'll be a lot of carry-on interest from this, and I'm sure folks will be very happy to see this video posted on our YouTube page. It'll make them very, very happy. They'll tell all their friends to watch it. So I
Oh,
have to
that's
thank
very
you from the
kind.
bottom of my heart. It's been a great evening. I learned a lot tonight, and I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate you joining us. So thank you, thank you.
Thank
Thank
you, and
you.
thanks for such a
Thank you so
great
much.
program and great community.
Thank you. Everybody have a good night.
Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Be well.